on the Mall in July. It was a well-deserved tribute to the Apollo 11 mission and an inspirational recognition of a proud moment in our nation's history. Since its establishment in 1846, the Smithsonian has become the world's largest museum, education, and research complex. The institution preserves and celebrates our nation's cultural heritage and advances scientific discovery in multiple disciplines. On behalf of the American people, Congress, the Board of Regents, and the Smithsonian management, you have a responsibility to ensure the continued success of the institution for future generations. The Smithsonian has a broad mission: the increase and diffusion of knowledge, and a bold strategic plan to support that mission. The critical goal in the plan is to reach 1 billion people a year through a digital-first strategy, making the Smithsonian's rich collections, first-class research, and empowering educational materials accessible to Americans across the country, not just those who visit Washington, D.C. That needs to be a fundamental part of the institution's strategy moving forward. Excuse me. I'm particularly pleased that my former boss and my mentor, Congressman John Shimkus, serves on the Board of Regents. His experience as a former educator allows him to provide the Smithsonian with unique perspectives to help advance this strategy. I look forward to hearing from you, Secretary Bunch, on your vision for achieving this goal and the institution's other priorities. As a large and complex organization with 19 museums and the National Zoo, multiple research centers, and an international presence, the Smithsonian also faces significant risks and challenges. First to mind is the Smithsonian's current $900 million renovation of one of the world's most visited museums, happened to be my twin boy's favorite, the National Air and Space Facility on the National Mall. That's being done while a portion of it remains open, thankfully, to the visiting public. Additionally, an increasing maintenance backlog that is just over $1 billion. Furthermore, inadequate storage space for collections, and finally, reports have identified much-needed IT security improvements, and I welcome the Inspector General's comments on these and other risks facing the institution and look forward to discussing the Smithsonian's approach to addressing them. In addition, there are several proposals for new Smithsonian museums. Establishing a new museum is a complex undertaking and should be carefully considered to ensure its success. With his experience as the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, we are hopeful that Secretary Bunch can provide the committee with insight into the issues surrounding the establishment of new museums and the keys to success in doing so. Finally, Secretary Bunch, I'm excited about the possibility of your visiting Springfield, Illinois, in my district, which happens to be the site of the 1908 race riots and the birthplace of the NAACP. The community would love to have you view the significant artifacts that are actually being excavated right now and tour the site, which the Department of Interior just determined was suitable for designation as a National Historic Monument. So thank you. I look forward to hearing from our witness today, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Other members' opening statements will be put into the record by unanimous consent. I would like to note that we have in our audience today Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, who is the author of the Women's History Museum Bill, which now has a sufficient number of co-sponsors to actually pass the House. So welcome, Representative Maloney. I'd like to welcome our witnesses now. Joining us this morning are the Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch, and the Smithsonian Inspector General, Kathy Helm. Secretary Bunch is the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian, and I'd like to highlight, as has been mentioned by the ranking member, the first African American to lead the institution. He assumed the role of Secretary in June 2019. While Secretary Bunch is new to his current position, he's certainly not new to the Smithsonian. From 2005 until this year, he served as director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, a spectacular museum, and if people have not yet visited it, I highly recommend that you do so. When he started that job in 2005, Mr. Bunch had one staff member, no collections, and no dedicated museum site. Thanks to his leadership, since the National Museum of African American History and Culture opened in 2016, it has welcomed more than 5 million visitors. It's compiled a collection of 40,000 objects that are housed in the first green building on the National Mall. He has served as the president of the Chicago Historical Society, as associate director for the curatorial affairs at the National Museum of American History during his career. He's also an accomplished author, having written on topics ranging from the American presidency to diversity and museum management. His most recent work, A Fool's Errand, is about his experience creating the African American History Museum, really a crowning glory of an achievement for you, sir. And we're so honored after the hearing, he has brought some artifacts from the Smithsonian for us to look at, which are really something special. So please do take a time after the hearing to take a look at them. Kathy Helm has been serving as Inspector General for the Smithsonian Institution since 2014. She's responsible for conducting audits and investigations, keeping the Board of Regents and Congress informed about problems and deficiencies, promoting efficiency and effectiveness within the Smithsonian, and preventing and detecting fraud, waste, and abuse. Inspector General Helm also serves as the Vice Chair of the Audit Committee for the Council of Inspector Generals on Integrity and Efficiency, and is chair of the Small Unique OIG Group, a group of Inspector Generals who meet quarterly to exchange ideas. Before she joined the Smithsonian, Inspector General Helm worked as the Deputy Inspector General at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, where she helped lead audit and investigative programs. Welcome to both of today's witnesses, and we thank you so much for coming. At this time, I would ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks, and all written statements may be made part of the record, and without objection, that is so ordered. I'll remind the witnesses that your entire statement will be made part of the record. We ask that your testimony, summarize your written statement at about 5 minutes. When the 5 minutes is nearing up, the little light will turn yellow, and when it's red, it means there are 5 minutes up. We'd ask you to wind it up. The record will remain open for at least 5 days for additional materials or questions to be submitted to you. So now we will turn to you, Secretary Bunch. Welcome, and we're eager to hear your testimony.
Thank you so much, Chairperson Laughran, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today. My tenure as the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian has been only a few short months, but as you've mentioned, my relationship with this institution goes back to when I was a 26-year-old kid. I was so honored to serve as the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I am more than pleased, in fact, I'm humbled, to assume the role as secretary of this institution, the institution I love so much. The Smithsonian greatly appreciates the continued support of Congress, the administration, and the American people, and we take seriously the crucial role we play in advancing the civic, educational, and scientific life of this nation. Our goal is to reach, in meaningful ways, at least 1 billion people worldwide. Nothing replaces the authentic artifacts we have on display, but we need to reach millions who cannot visit us in person using all the digital tools available to us. I am committed to achieving this goal while protecting and securing our digital assets and those of the users of our technology. Cultural institutions are uniquely equipped to inspire, and we magnify that ability when we truly reflect the rich tapestry of humanity. The Smithsonian is committed to increasing, attracting, and developing a diverse and talented workforce. I am pleased that Congress has supported the goal of telling more expansive and representative stories by shepherding legislation that advocates for new museums. If Congress deems it in the interest of the American public to authorize the Smithsonian to build a new museum, and provides the necessary additional funds for that purpose and appropriates means for a long-term operation of the museum, then we will create a museum that exceeds all expectations. A new museum that builds on the standards of excellence set by the Smithsonian. But in the interim, the institution is committed to making every single Smithsonian museum and program more inclusive and more representative of the nation's population. It is, as you pointed out, also crucially important that we recognize the Smithsonian's pressing infrastructure and collection space needs that demand our immediate and ongoing attention. We so appreciate the support of Congress in the renovation of the National Air and Space Museum. Just as important, we are grateful for the ongoing support of maintenance needs throughout the institution. Regarding the American Women's History Museum legislation, both the House and the Senate bills largely mirror the successful model employed by the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Both bills call to construct a museum with 50% federal and require the Smithsonian to raise 50% from non-federal sources. Legislation has also been introduced calling to create a National Museum of the American Latino in order to showcase the life, art, history, and culture of American Latinos and their contribution to the United States. This legislation also follows the model of the National Museum. While I do have experience with private fundraising and am more than willing to advocate for private funds, it is simply impossible to pursue projects of this magnitude without explicit appropriations of federal funding for the projects at their very genesis. If authorized and funded by Congress, we'd be honored to add these museums to the Smithsonian family. As Congress makes these deliberations, we will work diligently to tell a broader, more complete story with our resources. An example of this desire is our American Women's History Initiative, Because of Her Story, which was launched in 2018. Because of Her Story represents a paradigm shift. It allows the entire Smithsonian to wrestle with how issues of gender have shaped the American experience. We are grateful to Congress for this support. We are also so proud to be able to unveil in the fall of 2021 the first gallery to explore Latino culture to open on the National Mall. And we've worked very hard to make sure that the Smithsonian Asian Pacific Center, which has served to further the inclusion of Asian Pacific Americans, continues to research, build collections, do exhibitions and programs. And they, too, are also fundraising for the first gallery dedicated to them. Our work to increase knowledge is never-ending. The institution has been conducting groundbreaking research in science, in marine and terrestrial environments, and reproducing animals from around the world in their national habitat. Ultimately, what I want to do is say that museums are more important now than ever because of their ability to serve as trusted sources of information. We want the people to see the Smithsonian as a tool to help them understand their universe, their history, and our shaped future in order to live better lives. It is incumbent upon us as an institution to be a more universal resource, one that earns the American people's trust and leverages our great convening power to increase our relevance. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify. I'm happy to answer any and all questions.
Thank you very much. Now we'd hear from you, Ms. Helm.
Yes, Chairman Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the role of the Office of Inspector General in the oversight of the Smithsonian. As you know, OIG's mission is to promote the efficiency, effectiveness, and integrity of Smithsonian's programs and operations. We do this through independent and objective audits and investigations. Today, my testimony will focus on our work related to management challenges in the area of collection management, facilities management, and security. Collections are at the core of the Smithsonian. Our office has done extensive work examining collection stewardship. For instance, we reported in 2015 that the Smithsonian faces challenges to fully implement the plan that is to ensure the proper storage of its collections because of its estimated cost, more than $1 billion over 30 years, and the need to balance competing demands to fund other capital projects. Currently, we are assessing the inventory controls of the Smithsonian's newest museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The Smithsonian also faces challenges in addressing deferred maintenance for its facilities because it is spending less than the recommended amounts to maintain the condition of those facilities. In fiscal year 2017, the Smithsonian had a deferred maintenance backlog approaching $1 billion. Deferring maintenance can reduce the overall life of facilities and may lead to higher costs in the long term. Eventually, deferred maintenance requires a major capital investment. In fact, the Smithsonian's $650 million capital project to revitalize the National Air and Space Museum includes more than $250 million of deferred maintenance. Security is also a challenge. Information technology security is a growing risk for all organizations. Security breaches cost money, disrupt operations, and erode public trust. Each year, our office evaluates the effectiveness of Smithsonian's information technology security program. While the Smithsonian has made steady progress in improving this program, it is not yet fully effective. In addition, the Personnel Security Program helps to ensure that the individuals responsible for Smithsonian's collections, security, financial assets, and reputation have the appropriate character and conduct to be associated with the Smithsonian. We recently reported that individuals received pre-employment background investigations, but that the Smithsonian has no assurance that employees receive the appropriate level of post-employment background investigation. Moreover, the Smithsonian could have saved a third of its program cost in fiscal year 2016 if it had used an automated tool to determine the appropriate level of investigation for its retail employees. We also found that computer network access had been granted to individuals who had not received background investigations. Finally, in today's world, the importance of a skilled, well-trained security guard force is more important than ever. In a recent report, OIG found that new security guards were allowed to graduate from basic training, although they had missed one or more days of instruction. Moreover, guards only had to qualify on their firearms once a year, rather than twice a year as recommended by best practices. Thank you, Chairman Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee. This concludes my statement, and I'm happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you both for your testimony. Now is the time for members to ask questions, and I have a few. Secretary Bunch, one of the great things about being new is that you're not responsible for any of the problems. All you get to do is solve those that have been identified. So I'm wondering, in terms of the cybersecurity issues that have been identified, as well as the affirmative action deficits that you found, what are your plans to approach those identified issues?
In terms of cybersecurity, what we really appreciate has been the guidance that we've received from the Inspector General. This is a high priority for me. We have taken many steps to try to make sure that we filled all the holes. We recognize, however, that cybersecurity is going to be an ongoing issue, and we are committed to having the appropriate level of training and the appropriate staff expertise to make sure that we can respond to the ongoing challenge. My whole career has really been about making sure that a diverse array of scholars, educators, employees are allowed to help shape an institution and make it better. It is really clear to me that the Smithsonian has made amazing strides in my time there, but it is still very much a challenge, and I am committed to actually looking at diversity, not just in staff, but on the boards that also shape the Smithsonian. So ultimately for me, I think that when my tenure is up, one of the things I expect is the Smithsonian to have a much more diverse leadership and to really be the kind of place that mirrors the America we believe in.
Thank you for that. That leads me to my next question, which is the new museums that have been proposed that really reflect the greater diversity of our wonderful country. First, the Women's Museum that has so many co-sponsors, but also the Latino Museum that Representative Serrano is supporting, and there's also, it's not as far along, but a proposal for an Asian American museum. I'm wondering, what do you think are the next steps that we could take as a Congress to move those along? I know that there's been substantial fundraising for the Women's Museum, and there's efforts underway for the others. I hear your testimony that we also need to appropriate funds. It seems to me that the way to move this forward is to authorize these museums, which then will challenge our appropriators to match the private funds that have been raised with public funds. Your thoughts on that?
I think it's important, after going through 11 years of building a national museum, it's really clear that in order to move forward, one of the first things we need to do is identify what are all the challenges. And some of those are about funding and resources. Some of those about the process of how that funding gets released. Also, it is really the recognition that this is a long-term commitment, and that I think that if this is authorized, we would then really expect to do what we did with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which would have a period of several years to actually move this forward, to study what exactly we're talking about, what are the collections needs, what are the building needs, what are the scholarship needs, so that we would then have better idea of what the cost would be. But I think the key is to have that commitment to recognizing that it's a challenging endeavor. It's an endeavor that challenges the Smithsonian, candidly, but it's an endeavor with the right support we can do.
I think we're very lucky to have someone leading the whole institution who actually brought a fabulous museum from concept to reality. Just one final question. The Smithsonian recently conducted a very successful fundraising campaign. It raised $1.88 billion in the course of about 8 years. Can any of these private funds be used to address the backlog of deferred maintenance? What will those funds be used for?
I think a lot of those funds are committed to specific things, to educational programs, to supporting some of the research initiatives. We will always look at wherever we can take resources and put it towards deferred maintenance and other issues. But as you know, deferred maintenance isn't sexy. And so many of the donors are not interested in putting their money in that regard. So we have to look towards the federal government. We have to look to be more creative in the kinds of partnerships we put together that will allow us ultimately to do a better job of using those funds.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I turn now to the ranking member, Mr. Davis, for his questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The concern of post-employment background checks, huh? What are you hiding, Mr. Secretary? Hey, I am more than willing to offer up Mr. Aguilar for a test of post-employment background check. You okay with that, Pete? Thank you, thank you. And Mr. Secretary, how concerned are you about the size and growth of the facility's maintenance backlog, and what's your strategy to reduce it?
I am very concerned about this. I think that we are looking at prioritizing very clearly in a triage method. What are the priorities we have to do? What is it about mission critical? What is it that is clearly about public safety, safety of the collection? So we're doing a better job of making sure we're putting what limited resources we have in the priorities that we're focusing on. We're also looking at what are creative ways, like with the renovation of the Air and Space Museum, that we're able to bring funds in that will allow us to get to some of those backlogs. We're also obviously looking very carefully at some of the initiatives that allow us to look at maintenance, like the South Mall Master Plan, and looking to see, is that the best way we can accomplish these things? So I'm committed to now revisiting this, taking a hard look at it, and figuring out what's the best way that we can use those limited resources.
Great, thank you. The institution must be perceived as an honest broker and apolitical, particularly when Americans remain divided on many issues. I have to say, after seeing the caption for the portrait of Ronald Reagan at the National Portrait Gallery, I had some concerns. How does the Smithsonian ensure it remains an honest broker of that information? And I want to emphasize to you how important it is in your new role of being seen as non-political and nonpartisan.
I think it is crucially important to emphasize throughout the organization that we are a nonpartisan entity. I think the greatest strength of building the National Museum of African American History and Culture is that we were seen as nonpartisan. We had support from both sides of the aisle, and I continue to work in that regard. I think it's crucial to understand that things like label copy, we always vet them. We review them through the curators, through the directors of the museum. When there are issues that go beyond that, they're brought to the secretarial level. We are committed to using our research, using our scholarship, and that guides what we do. Not political considerations, but the best evidence that comes from the research that we have.
Well, thank you. Take a look at the Reagan caption again, then we could talk after that. You mentioned, Ms. Helm, that the digitization of the collections will help improve collections management. Have you been able to assess the Smithsonian's digitization plan, including the pace of digitization? And if so, what's your assessment?
Yes, several years ago, we did a report where we looked at the collection storage plan as well as the digitization plan, and found that the Smithsonian was working towards digitization, is committed to it, but it will be a long-term effort that will require time and resources.
Okay, well, let's hope it beats the Canon Renewal Project. Okay. Secretary Bunch, reaching all DC area K through 12 students is a worthy objective in your strategic plan. Can you discuss your plans to achieve it, and do you plan to extend that reach more broadly across the country, as I mentioned in my opening statement?
I believe that the Smithsonian is one of the most important educational institutions in this country, and that it really needs to play a role, not just in the traditional way museums do work, but in non-traditional ways, in really figuring out how do we put the resources we have to really help improve K through 12 education. I have made that a cornerstone of my tenure. I've said that it's not enough just to bring kids into the Smithsonian. What you really need to do is make sure we're helping people wrestle with the curricular challenges, helping students get the fullest learning journey possible. I want to use what we're doing in the District of Columbia as a pilot to test how it is that the Smithsonian can really not only help children, but excite teachers and give teachers mid-career rejuvenation, create opportunities for parents to be part of that learning journey for their children. What I hope will happen is that the ideas we test, both the actual ideas and the virtual ideas that we will use in the district, will allow us then to continue to expand the work that we already do nationally. I am committed to the Smithsonian ultimately being a place that influences, enhances, and enriches K through 12 education throughout the United States.
Well, thank you both. I yield back.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Madam Chair, thank you, and welcome, Ms. Helm, Mr. Bunch. Congratulations, Mr. Bunch, on your new book and on your very inspiring and successful service as the director of the National Museum on African American History and Culture. And my first question is actually about that. It's obviously inspired other efforts, as the chair was saying, to create, a museum on the woman, American women, on a Latino museum, an Asian American museum. Tell me, one of the remarkable things about the African American Museum is, first of all, I think it's now the most popular museum destination. Is that right?
It's one of the most popular.
It's one of them, yeah. But it's a remarkable thing when you go over there, because you get people coming from all over the place, all over the world, all over America, large, multiracial, multicultural crowds coming in to check it out. And so I'm wondering if you would just reflect for a moment on how museums that focus on a certain dimension of the American experience can speak universally to everybody in the country, and how should we think about all of these proposals, coming forward for other museums similar to that?
I think the most important thing that we did in building the National Museum of African American History and Culture was from the beginning saying this was not a museum by a community for a particular community. That we said this is an opportunity to understand America through the lens of an African American community. And what that meant is it became the story for us all, that everybody could find themselves in that story, whether they were interested in our notions of liberty, our notions of citizenship. So what I think the major contribution would be is that any museum that is created, whether it's a Latino museum or women's history museum, that we're not trying to create that ancillary story. We're trying to say, this is the best way, another way, to understand America. And I think that makes it not something that is separate, but part of the glue that helps us understand our identity.
Well, but I think you achieved precisely that vision in a remarkable way at this museum. It is a window into American history for all of us, and it deepens everybody's appreciation of what America is. So I salute that vision, and I hope it's one that we will continue to realize as we move forward with other projects in the future. The Art and Industries Building recently reopened as a space for special events. What do you envision as the long-term plan for use of this building?
The Arts and Industries Building is really one of my favorite buildings in the Smithsonian. And I think what we want to do now is we've put together people working on what is the long-term future for that building. Right now, we're committed to sort of doing major exhibition that will be part of our celebration for our 175th anniversary of the Smithsonian in 2021. I think that in the meantime, we're now looking at what does it mean to rethink the works of the Castle Building and the Arts and Industries Building, and to see how we're going to use those. At this stage, I've just put people on that, and I will get briefed, but it's one of my priorities to figure out what is the long-term use of the A&I building and the Castle.
Okay. And you're getting input from presumably the board and other stakeholders?
What we're doing is we're not only looking at what the staffs thought, or the Board of Regents are very involved in that. We will do, as I always do, when we think of long-term use, we will reach out to a variety of communities and stakeholders to get an understanding of what they want. I think it's really crucial for us to recognize that the history of the Smithsonian is tied up in those two buildings, and we want to make sure that they're always there to serve the American public.
Okay, I know about the big revitalization project going on with Air and Space. What other major facilities projects do you foresee for the Smithsonian in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think really the big ones are the arts industry and the Castle, is to figure out what we're doing there, and then to really make a determination about what the South Mall Master Plan really is, to look at those questions. The other thing will be beginning to look at a sculpture garden for part of the Hirshhorn Museum, to really think about how do we make sure the mall is visitor-friendly and that it serves as great entrances to all the museums. So I think those are some of the things we'll be looking at in the next several years.
Thank you. I think my time's up. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you both for being here. I've always been a huge fan of the Smithsonian, so this is a chance that we can engage with you guys to make sure that we have plans and policies in place for long-term sustainability of this this national asset. Of course, there's always concerns that are arisen, that rise, challenges we must face, and so I appreciate your willingness to step up and take the lead and hopefully resolve some of the issues that are out there. And there isn't an agency or organization that doesn't face some of these issues, but I do have some specific questions about some of the challenges, especially on the deferred maintenance backlog. And I know that can be or it is a significant challenge at this point. And so, Ms. Helm, what is the current cost in dollars as far as the maintenance, deferred maintenance backlog today? Do you know?
I believe for fiscal year 2017, it was approximately $937 million.
Okay, getting close to $1 billion
Right,
in that.
approaching $1 billion.
As far as the time, how deep does this go? I mean, how far back are some of the maintenance issues? How long have they been out there?
So the deferred maintenance backlog has been around for a long time and is created by the fact that the National Research Council recommends that government agencies spend between 2 to 4% of the replacement value of their buildings, and the Smithsonian's budget has been about 1%. So each year, the backlog just continues to grow.
Yeah. Do you know what if I was to look at the list of the backlog, what's the oldest date?
I
You
do
know,
not know that.
Does it go a decade or 5 years?
I could get that information
Okay,
for you.
I would appreciate
I'd be
it.
happy to.
Secretary Bunch, what's your plan to go after the backlog? Are you looking to get more to the 2 to 4% in expenditures? Or?
I think my goal is to try to be at 2 to 4%, to try to get around at least 2%. I'd like to get at 3%. I think the challenge for us is to figure out, all right, how do we make sure that when we're looking at our congressional appropriation, to make sure that we've got money that's going to allow us to grow in that direction, and also to think maybe creatively more about, are there opportunities when we're fundraising for the projects that people are excited about? Is there a way to layer in some support for backlog? Right. I think that that's what we're going to be looking at. I don't have an answer yet, but I'll have it soon.
Well, I appreciate anything you do because, you know, from a prior business owner's perspective and all this, you clean house before you expand. And, you know, through the discussions of potential new museums, which I'm very excited about, I think it's important that we kind of get the house clean before we look at expanding anymore, because my concern would be further expansion just creates more of a backlog unless we address that early. So I'd appreciate anything that you can provide us on plans to move forward, because I think as this institution goes from a funding mechanism, a solid plan would help us in being able to appropriate more toward that. I do have some questions on information security, since that is my background. But first, the $900 million cost for renovation for Air and Space Museum. When I just looked at that, I thought it had to be a mistake. So I had my staff to go back and look at it again, and like, no, that's the cost. And it just seems very high to me, since it was the cost to build the African American Museum was $540 million. Museum of Bible was $500 million. The Nationals Park from construction was only $701 million. Trump Tower was $300 million. Right. Why such a high cost, almost $1 billion for refurbishment?
Well, I think first of all, you know that it's often cheaper to build new than to refurbish. Right. I think that part of this is that this was also the opportunity to upgrade all the systems, to make sure that this is an effective green-like museum that we can make. Also, I think that even though the building was opened in 1976, in terms of the life of the construction at that time, this building's been around a long time. Right. And so, in essence, what we're trying to do is to do almost what you said about the deferred maintenance. We want to fix it all. We don't want to postpone things so that whoever follows me will have to wrestle with the Air and Space Museum. That's why it's costing what it is.
Okay, I appreciate that. I know I'm out of time. I'll submit my questions for information system security for the record, but I appreciate all that you're doing. Again, Air and Space Museum, as an aviator, that is one of my favorite, most frequented museums, and we thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you.
Or yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yield back to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis. Is right.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Secretary Bunch, and Ms. Helm, thank you for your leadership as well. I'm so glad you had an opportunity to talk a little bit about how the experience of delivering the African American Museum of History and Culture informs what you're doing today. I still remember that day. It was extraordinary. And I'm very hopeful that really makes a difference for all of us, and we appreciate the fact that you're there. I wonder if you could just a few more thoughts about the importance of the treasures that we have on our mall, the Smithsonian, for the young people of our country. I often ask students when I go into classrooms if they've been to Washington, D.C. before. Maybe if they're by 8th grade, they've come, but most often that's not the case. I was just with a class the other day, and while that's a local effort, it's incredible to me that, you know, a large number of our children throughout this country never make it here to the Capitol and to see these treasures that we have. So I think as we can think more about that and collaborating with the local communities, that would be helpful. Obviously, the role of teachers is critically important to be able to translate that experience for young people as well. If you have any thoughts about that. The other thing I wanted to ask you briefly is, you know, we're talking about the pressure and the need for more museums. I mean, there's so many interests that we want represented on the mall. How much space do we have for that? How do you see that space as you look at the entire mall? Are there areas that we could redevelop perhaps better on the mall? Where does that stand?
Let me ask the last first. I think that it's clear that there's very little space left on the mall. And that one of the questions is to begin to think about what's the best use of what we have left. Are there other spaces near the mall that ought to be used that can continue to maybe spread the influence of the Smithsonian? I understand the power of the mall. It was really important to me that the National Museum be on the mall. So I think the key is to look at the spaces, what can we do with what we have, but recognize there are really limited spaces on the mall. I think that from an education point of view, the Smithsonian is amazing. I think about, in my career, holding the compass that Lewis and Clark carried when they went across the country, or looking at the Apollo 11 capsule. And what I realized is that we have to find ways to get this around the country. Part of that is through the traveling exhibitions and all the things we tend to do, but also it really is looking at what can we do virtually. It seems to me there ought to be a way that virtually the Smithsonian can get into every classroom in the United States. And even simple ideas of helping people get the virtual Lincoln's top hat or Lewis and Clark's compass that they can make on a 3D printer, that allows the teachers in the classrooms to talk about the importance of citizenship or exploration. So I think the goal that I've challenged the educational staff is to say to me, how can we touch every classroom? How can we share the wonders of the Smithsonian research, science, art, and history? So that's a major commitment to me, because I want children to be made better by the wonders of the Smithsonian.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm going to turn that back to the chairwoman. Thank you very much.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me thank both of you for your testimony today. Dr. Bunch, I want to thank you particularly for your service, not just to the Smithsonian, but to the country. I've got to get used to calling you Secretary Bunch. That's going to be a transformation for me. But in any event, I've followed your career down through the years, and I've said to you privately, and I'll say publicly today, thank you.
Thank you.
You have a great challenge in front of you, and I'm sure those of us on this committee will join hands with you and try to make the Smithsonian even better than it is. I will certainly do my part. But let me just spend just a couple of minutes talking to you about diversity. You know how strongly I feel about that, and we've talked about it over the years. Give me some appreciation for the workforce, the size of the workforce that's under your jurisdiction.
There are approximately 7,000 people that work for the Smithsonian.
All based in D.C.?
No, they're all over the country.
All right.
Whether it is people that work out of the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory in Boston, the people that work at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama, in New York City, we have
These are
several
federal
museums.
employees?
Federal employees.
These are on your payroll?
Yes.
Okay.
And that, in essence, the goal for us is to make sure that these staff reflect the diversity of America. We're not there yet. And especially, I want to make sure it reflects diversity at the senior positions. I want to make sure that we're not just looking at the lower introductory positions, but that senior curators, leaders of institutions, the Smithsonian has done, I think, a very good job on issues of gender and leadership. Many of the museum directors are now women. I think we've done a less successful job of embracing diversity of racial or ethnic minorities in leadership positions.
So the different layers are senior leadership, lower level leadership, would that be entry level type
Right,
jobs?
right.
What is the middle strata called? What do you
Well,
call
basically,
that? Just career?
I would say career staff.
And do you collect data on the demographics of these different layers?
We have all that data, and I can make sure that we can present that to you.
Which category is the strongest and which one is the weakest in terms of racial diversity?
Well, and racial diversity is, quite candidly, at the lower levels, guard, security, low-level administration. I think that within the levels where it fundamentally shapes the Smithsonian, curators, scientists, that's where we're working to improve that.
What about your vendors? Do you have a vendor list?
We do very well with that. We have a very strong supplier diversity program that, whether it is the fact that when we built the National Museum of African American History and Culture, we made sure that minorities, women-owned businesses received a higher percentage than ever before. We do that throughout the Smithsonian, so I'm very pleased with that part of the Smithsonian. The vendor work that we do really reaches a broad and diverse
Do you
audience.
pledge to us that you will continue that and try to build upon that?
There's no doubt about that. That is crucial to our success.
You mentioned in your earlier testimony that something about the boards that shape the institution. I don't quite understand what that means.
So that each Smithsonian museum has its own board. And these are boards that help with fundraising, help guide the institute, the different museums, for example. What I want to make sure is that we don't forget that they need to be made more diverse, that there are opportunities for people of color, women, to play a more leading role on some of those boards.
I guess there are dozens of boards across the spectrum.
Each museum has its board. Some of the research entities have their own boards.
And is
So-
that data available?
Excuse me?
Is that data available?
We can make sure you can have that data.
All right. Finally, sir, do you provide technical resources to community-based groups who want to preserve their history? I won't ask you about financial resources because I know you're kind of stretched on that, but technical resources, yes.
We do it on several different levels.
Yeah.
Different museums do it in different ways. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, when I actually created a unit whose job it was to work with local museums, to provide training, to provide expertise. So what I'm hoping is that that is a model that will be picked up by some of the other museums within the Smithsonian. But we also do a fair amount of training through some of the programs we do. When we do sites exhibitions, sometimes there's training reaching out to local communities, so that in essence, we want to do a much better job, a more formal job, and I'm looking to see how much do we emulate the model that we created at the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
This is exciting. Thank you very much. Thank both of you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And Mr. Secretary, it's nice to see you again.
See you.
Thank you both for your testimony. I do want to just recognize Madam Clerk has joined us, who I think came from the Smithsonian. It's nice to see you, Madam Clerk. Mr. Secretary, let me also say it is refreshing to have both the Secretary and the Inspector General on the same page. We don't hear that an awful lot, so thank you. Well, let me ask a question. You talked about the cost of deferred maintenance. I ask you, beyond cost, are any collections actually at risk because of deferred maintenance?
It is important for us, for me, that we protect those collections because that's what's really at the heart of the Smithsonian. And we have really worked hard to make sure that collections are not at risk. We've worked hard to identify areas of concern, and we will continue to do that. When we know that if there are collections at risk, we move quickly to try to protect them and to give them the proper housing that they need. I think that the goal will be, however, that we're really stretched and we need the resources to continue to do things like build new storage pods out in Suitland or out near the Udvar Hazy Museum. Those are the kind of things that are going to allow us not to just provide bare maintenance, but provide the kind of quality care that is at the heart of the Smithsonian.
Do you agree, Madam Inspector General?
Yes, I do think that their collection space plan that they developed has that in goal. I think there are facilities that have been identified as being at an acceptable level, but I'm not aware of collections being at risk of immediate harm or anything like that.
All right, let me ask this question. We are talking about now the revitalization of the National Air and Space Museum. What do you do with things like the large pieces of those collections while it's underway?
What we do is, the goal is to try to give the public as much access to those collections as possible. So some of the large pieces that get moved out to the new storage places out in Dulles and other areas out in Suitland, but we try to make sure that there's enough on display so that the public is really still engaged and gets a lot of that history. We also encourage people to go out to the Udvar Hazy Center out in Dulles, which is where a lot of the larger airplanes are, and it's another way to continue that story of understanding the history of aviation.
Okay, so now, does your digitization initiative, is it going to say physical storage at some point? How is that going to work?
What digitization does is about protecting the collections by reducing the use on them, pulling them out. It also, however, gets the collections out to a broader possible audience. It doesn't reduce the collections we have. I think the challenge for the Smithsonian is to realize that we're always going to continue to grow the collections. What we want to do is make sure that we've got the sort of processes to make sure that it's crucially important when we collect something and that we have the space and the resources to protect it.
So go ahead. If there were one thing that you would ask us today that is your top priority, what would it be?
Can I get two?
I'll give you two.
All right. I think that my top priority has to be making the Smithsonian accessible virtually, to really make sure we can educate people around the country and around the globe. I think my second priority, candidly, is to find ways to address the backlog. To make sure that these amazing facilities are protected and made accessible to the American people.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Bunch, you talked a little bit about the creation of the National Museum of the American Latino. You're familiar with the history. In 2008, President Bush created the commission. The report was completed in 2011. It gave a project cost, I'm certain at the time, $600 million. You identified, you mentioned identifying future challenges involved if Congress was to move forward and to give you guidance. Right now, there is authorizing language, as the chair mentioned. 179 members in a bipartisan fashion have signed on to this bill. I know the sponsor, Mr. Serrano, has worked with you on the public-private partnership funding piece, making sure that the language was sufficient for your needs. What's the timeline from when the bill is signed into law to the next steps and to ultimately a completion? If history is our guide, what does that look like?
Well, it took 11 years to build the National Museum of African American History once we had leadership, because that's really the key, the director. So I really think that that's probably a good framework. We might be able to do some things that can shorten a little. I've got ideas about doing that. But the challenge of building the staff, building the mechanism that allows us to raise the money, getting a better sense of what the content is really going to be, bringing on people that can help think about the building itself, and ultimately looking at what are the long-term resource needs to make sure that when it opens, we recognize that's the beginning, not the end of the process. So I think that it is a decade-long process once you actually begin by bringing on a director.
I appreciate that. This year, Congressman Serrano is working on language in the Interior Appropriations Bill that would encourage the Smithsonian report language to continue exploring the creation of the museum. and to look to programs, exhibits, collections, and public outreach. Do you see any problems complying with language that continues to give you guidance to move in that direction?
Not at all. And in fact, I would argue one of the ways that you can shorten the period of building a museum, if that's where we go, is to really have curators, to do exhibitions that allow us to begin to get the research. One, that gets people excited, and that's part of the key to raising the successful funds. Two, one of the great challenges is going to be is building the collection. And if we can do work now that will foreshadow some of the collections needs, actually bring collections into the Smithsonian, that'll allow us to move this a little quicker.
Great, I appreciate it. Following up on what my colleague, Mr. Butterfield, talked about, I know you're familiar, in 1994, the Smithsonian Institute Task Force produced a report called Willful Neglect. And since that report, the Latinx workforce in the Smithsonian has risen 2.7% to 10%. Unfortunately, that growth hasn't met the same numbers at the executive level. And so you started to answer Mr. Butterfield's question about, the higher levels, curators, scientists, executives. Can you talk to me about what's being done to increase the diversity at the executive level?
One of the things that's important to me is as I look at whatever changes, individuals I bring into the senior level, I want to make sure that diversity is really at the heart of what I'm trying to do. I would be unbelievably disappointed if I didn't, by the end of my tenure, have a staff that is more diverse. It's a challenge in many ways because, one, people never leave the Smithsonian. So, but my goal is to make sure that the Smithsonian is made better when it has those diverse voices around the table.
I appreciate the answer. Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields back, and all members have now had an opportunity to ask questions. And as I mentioned earlier, the record will remain open for 5 legislative days. We would like to thank you both for your testimony here today. I'll just note that I think I speak for the entire committee how proud we are of the institution, of the Smithsonian Institute is really a jewel that belongs to the American people. I was just thinking and talking to the ranking member, back in the mid-1990s, I think Congressman Vic Fazio was the chairman of this committee and took the lead to insist that we do the funding necessary to repair the Library of Congress and the Botanical Gardens. Repairs and maintenance are not sexy, but these facilities are really held in trust for the American people. And I think one of the things we need to do is to see whether this isn't that kind of time to work with our appropriators to make sure that we're fulfilling our obligation to make sure that these jewels are maintained for future generations. And your leadership is very important in that regard. Unless there are further matters before us on this oversight hearing, we thank you, and the hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.